Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the remarkable, and often terrifying, world of medieval motherhood. These were the women who faced childbirth when your best prenatal care was prayer, and your midwife doubled as the village gossip. So before we start, take a second to like and subscribe, if you actually enjoy this sort of thing. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I'm always fascinated to see this little global watch party. First off, congratulations. You've managed to get pregnant without modern medicine, fertility apps, or even much personal space. Welcome to medieval pregnancy, where your womb is basically public property and science is, mostly vibes. Forget pee sticks. Instead, you pee in a clay pot and someone sniffs it, squints at the bubbles, or declares it smells of female essence. That's your diagnostic test. If you're lucky, an herbalist will drop a needle in your urine. If it rusts, you're pregnant. Or haunted. Possibly both. Naturally, you try to keep it secret, but by day 3 your vomiting gives you away. Within a week, half the village is whispering, and the midwife is dropping not-so-subtle hints like, don't carry anything heavier than your own sins. Your diet? A nightmare of contradictions. No eels, they'll make the baby slippery. No cabbage, it breeds flatulence and heresy. And no rabbit meat, unless you want a child with wild eyes. Instead, you're urged to eat white bread, apples, and leftovers the neighbor's goat didn't want. Meanwhile, the protection charms roll in. Someone hands you a lump of lead to wear. Another insists on wolf's fur above your bed. Your mother-in-law presents you with a walnut carved with the Lord's Prayer. She swears it kept her safe through 9 births. 6 of which survived. By medieval standards, that's a flex. The rules don't stop there. Don't look at the moon, or your baby might be marked. Don't step over dogs. Don't think sinful thoughts, especially about Brother Oswin, the suspiciously handsome monk. And definitely don't laugh during thunderstorms. Everything, apparently, leaves a mark. The priest urges confession, because who knows, your sins might rub off on the baby. So you sit through a sermon on Eve and temptation, clutching the latest cure, a dried toad sewn into a pouch and tied to your hip. Yes, a literal toad. For womb balance. As for your husband? He's over the moon. He celebrates by downing too much ale and bragging to anyone who'll listen that his seed took root. Welcome to medieval motherhood, equal parts miracle, misery, and community theater. He won't be there for the delivery. Of course not. Childbirth is women's work, witchcraft, and mostly just work. So you wait, charm-laden, frog-adjacent, and mildly terrified. Welcome to your first trimester, where medical advice boils down to don't anger God and maybe drink some warm milk. You're expecting, but unlike today, there's no prenatal yoga, no glowing bump selfies, and definitely no baby shower where someone gifts you artisanal pacifiers. Instead, your medieval prenatal care package includes superstition, guesswork, a handful of roots, and a stern midwife who smells like garlic and knows all your secrets. First things first, your health. The village healer recommends you stay warm, but not too warm. Move, but not too much. Think pleasant thoughts, but only if they don't involve men. In short, live your life, but do nothing that might upset your humors. Ah yes, the humors. Those 4 charming bodily fluids that medieval doctors insisted controlled everything from pregnancy to personality. At the moment, you're mostly phlegm. Congratulations. Your prenatal vitamins? Plants with questionable reputations, rue, fennel, mugwort. You're told to boil them into tea, but no one mentions the side effects, nausea, fainting, and hallucinations of Saint Margaret telling you to lie down. She's the patron saint of childbirth. She's very busy. As your belly grows, The midwife stops by more often, mostly to check you haven't done anything reckless, like ride a horse, look at a wolf, or, God forbid, speak Latin. All high-risk behaviors. You're supposed to stay calm, avoid storms, and under no circumstances witness an execution. Apparently, it might scare the baby crooked. Easier said than done when executions are basically the town's Netflix. Then there's your emotional state. Sadness, they say, makes sickly babies. Which is a little unfair, given the whole medieval reality thing. To help, the women gather around you, singing hymns and trading gossip. They tie red ribbons to your bedposts, hang garlic from the rafters, and sometimes sleep on your floor in case demons find your scent irresistible. Comforting, isn't it? Finally, the big milestone, quickening, the first flutter of the baby's movement. It's treated like a royal coronation. You're congratulated, kissed, and possibly sprinkled with holy water. Just to be safe. The midwife nods wisely, mutters, a strong one, probably not cursed, and that's the closest thing you get to reassurance. Your final months are spent waddling around like a goose in boots, avoiding stairs, and trying not to sneeze too hard, because rumor has it, one good sneeze might trigger labor. Baths are forbidden too. Apparently, water loosens things. And then, it's time. Not that you were given a due date. In the Middle Ages, there's no countdown calendar, just groaning and the lingering fear that if you drop a turnip, the baby might tumble out too. Congratulations. You are now being ushered into the sacred birthing chamber, otherwise known as your bedroom, but darker, hotter, and filled with women clutching herbs. Step 1. Block out the light. Windows are covered, candles dimmed, and men barred from entry. Why? Because bright light might confuse the baby, summon demons, or make you sin with your eyes. Nobody's quite sure. In the flickering shadows, you see lavender, mugwort, and nettles dangling from the rafters. These are supposed to calm your womb and protect your soul. You don't argue, though one bunch smells suspiciously like last week's soup. Enter the midwife. She's wearing a blood-stained apron and the face of someone who has seen everything twice. Her toolkit includes a birthing stool, hot water, some cloths, a crucifix, and, possibly, a knife. Best not to ask. You're told to breathe. Not too fast, not too slow, and not so loud you scare the baby. Then you're lowered onto the birthing stool, essentially a chair with a hole cut in it, because gravity is the only reliable medical technology here. Comfort? Not a priority. Around you, women chant prayers to Saint Margaret and occasionally splash holy water on your ankles. One waves a relic over your head. Another just knits. Apparently it sets the mood. Someone hands you a drink that tastes like warm wine mixed with bad decisions. And then the screaming begins. You try not to, because bravery, but the stool is brutal, the room is stifling, and a woman is rubbing goose fat on your thighs while reciting psalms. This isn't a spa. This is medieval childbirth. Outside, your husband paces, drinks, or naps, his holy trinity of uselessness. He'll hear the news when someone leans out the window and shouts, "It is done." If anyone deserves sainthood here, it's not him. It's the midwife, commander-in-chief of medieval womb warfare. Think battlefield medic, therapist, herbalist, and part-time exorcist, just in case things get weird. That's your midwife. Let's call her Agnes, because statistically, there's a very good chance her name is Agnes. Agnes has seen it all. She's delivered more babies than most monks have copied psalms. She enters the birthing chamber like she owns it, armed with a bundle of herbs, a wooden cross, and the kind of authority that doesn't tolerate screaming, unless it's useful. Certified? Hardly. Her credentials come from whispers, observation, and surviving childbirth herself, often more than once. Her kit is simple but deadly effective: a birthing stool, a knife for cords or demons, some dried roots, and hands tough enough to wrestle a goat. Most importantly, she has an unshakable poker face. If she's calm, everyone's calm. If she raises her voice, someone is probably about to die. Usually, though, she's muttering gems like, "That's normal," or "Keep breathing," or, if necessary, "I'll slap you." She knows when to rub your back, when to hold your hand, and exactly when to tell your mother-in-law to shut up. She's memorized every prayer in the book, one for safe delivery, one for stillbirth, one for twins, and one for breaking whatever curse your grandmother may have left behind. Socially, midwives live on a knife's edge. They are respected, because without them, villages collapse. But they are also feared. Too many successes, and people whisper witch. Too many losses, and people whisper bad omen. Basically, if you're a woman who knows too much and doesn't shriek during thunderstorms, you're already on a list. Still, Agnes shows up every time. Rain or snow, plague or famine, she's there. Breech births, stillbirths, births where a goat wanders into the room, she doesn't flinch. She's the closest thing you'll ever get to a hospital. And when the baby finally arrives, she doesn't celebrate. She just wraps the child, nods once, and moves on. Another miracle, another Tuesday. Thank you, Agnes, you chaotic medieval goddess. Ah, but pain relief. That mythical concept your 21st century brain keeps praying for. Sadly, you were born 700 years too early for epidurals, anesthesiologists, or even a decent glass of wine. In the Middle Ages, the philosophy was simple: pain builds character. And if childbirth didn't hurt, God wouldn't have designed it that way. Thanks, theology. So, you endure labor with grim dignity. Screaming is allowed, but only if it sounds holy. Wailing too loudly risks attracting demons, or worse, your neighbors, who will definitely gossip about it at market. Were there remedies? Sort of. Holy relics, for one. Someone presses a splinter of St. Margaret's femur into your palm. Is it real? Who knows? Does it help? Not really. But at least it gives you something to clench while you scream into eternity. Next up, herbal relief. You're handed a steaming concoction of valerian, mugwort, and something that smells like despair. It tastes even worse. By the second sip, you begin to suspect pain management just means assaulting your taste buds while your uterus stages a coup. Other options include biting down on leather, wood, or a tightly woven rag. Not for medical benefit, just so you don't terrify the other women waiting their turn. If labor drags on, you can always fall back on the classic prayer. The right prayer, at the right volume, in hopes God will bump you up in divine triage. Bonus points if a priest is nearby. Penalty points if he looks terrified and bolts. And then there are the midwife's hands, surprisingly effective, though not because of technique. Mostly because she's old, strong, and persuasive. She'll bark things like, "Don't be a coward. Your grandmother had 12. Or, most often, "Push, or I'll curse you myself." So yes, your pain relief options are hope, prayer, and the soothing background noise of livestock. Don't worry, the agony will pass. Eventually. Maybe. If all goes well, your reward is not rest, but immediate breastfeeding and exactly zero postpartum care. Because in the medieval world, once the baby's out, you're back to being useful again. Naturally, you ask, how long will this take? The midwife responds with a grunt and a prayer to Saint and patron saint of mothers. Which is not exactly a timetable. Welcome to medieval labor, where time has no meaning, and pain is measured in rosary cycles. 2 hours? 2 days? Nobody brought a sundial. You sit on the birthing stool, then lie down, then squat, then pace, then kneel, then curse, then sit again because your knees sound like a bag of walnuts. Each position, the midwife insists, helps the baby find its way. You begin to suspect the child is navigating with a medieval map full of dragons, dead ends, and poor directions. The room grows hot, then cold, then hot again. Hours, or centuries, pass. Is it still Tuesday? Was Tuesday ever real? Is this even your house anymore? The women keep spirits up by swapping labor stories. One brags she gave birth during a thunderstorm, and now her son can smell lightning. Another swears that rubbing lard on your back while chanting psalms backward makes the baby slide right out. No one volunteers to test this theory. Meanwhile, your contractions march on like a drunken feast, loud, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. You try counting them. You lose track. You try singing between them. You lose your will to sing. Eventually, you give up and just stare at the wall, naming cobwebs. One of them, disturbingly, seems to be moving. Every so often, someone hands you broth, pats your arm, or tells you to just relax. Which is about as helpful as suggesting you politely negotiate with a hurricane. Anyone who panics is swiftly escorted out of the chamber for their own safety. No clocks mark the hours, only the flicker of candlelight, the sweat dripping down your brow, and the unnerving fact that the midwife still hasn't blinked once. And then, chaos sharpens. The midwife leans in, nods, and declares, "It's time." Time for what exactly? Glory? Ruin? Internal collapse? Doesn't matter. Your body has staged a coup. You are about to push a tiny medieval citizen into a world fueled by mud, superstition, and goat-based nutrition. Congratulations, you've reached the climax of eternity. Outside, your husband, let's call him Wolfrich, because of course his name is Wolfrich, paces in the courtyard, fingering his prayer beads like he's trying to start a fire. He has no idea what's happening inside but assumes it involves blood, screaming, and maybe Saint Margaret herself dropping by for a cameo. And no, he's not invited in. Childbirth in the Middle Ages is strictly women's business. Men are banned, partly for safety, mostly for sanity. Husbands faint. They panic. They ask idiotic questions like, "Is that noise normal? Should it be bending that way?" Or, the classic, "Can I get a chair?" No. Wolfrich's duties are simple: pace, pray, and look worried, ideally in that order. If he truly wants to help, he can fetch linens, slaughter a chicken for the post-birth stew, or stop interrupting the midwife every 20 minutes with, "Is it here yet?" The only exception to the ban? If you die. Then Wolfrich may be summoned in to look stricken, clutch your hand, and within a fortnight, marry your cousin. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Inside, the women have things firmly in hand. You're being fanned with a goose wing, the midwife is muttering incantations, and the herbalist has just spilled something suspiciously green by the fireplace. Everything is, somehow, according to plan. Meanwhile, outside, Wolfrich continues pacing in the company of older men who nod gravely and offer comfort in the form of useless platitudes. "It's in God's hands now." Or, "My third wife survived one just like this." No one suggests going inside. The last man who tried was slapped by a midwife and promptly excommunicated for impertinence. In short, childbirth is women's work. Men may contribute at the start and cheer at the end, but during the messy, painful middle, the best thing they can do is stay out of the way and avoid weeping into the turnips. And so, after hours, or perhaps days, of contractions, panting, praying, and feeling like your bones are turning inside out, the moment finally arrives. You've arrived at the headline act, medieval childbirth. Spoiler, it's messy. Your options are limited: squat in the corner, collapse on a straw-stuffed mattress, or take the sacred birthing stool. Sacred, of course, meaning it's just a wooden toilet seat with delusions of grandeur. Gravity is technically helping you, though mostly it just feels rude. The midwife, a woman with forearms that could shoe a horse, crouches in front of you. She's seen this hundreds of times, often while stirring soup with the other hand. Calm, relentless, she orders you to push. And you do. Then again. Then again. Until you're fairly sure your soul is trying to crawl out too. There are no whale song playlists, no epidurals. Just the rustle of skirts, the sharp gasps of other women, and the low murmur of a prayer drifting in from the priest outside. The chickens outside the window remain completely unimpressed. The baby, meanwhile, works on its own medieval schedule. Then, sudden shift. A cry, a splash, a collective gasp. With one last, ungodly effort, you deliver what feels like a cannonball wrapped in slime. The midwife snatches it up with the same ease she'd catch a falling turnip. She checks for the standard issue limbs, declares the sex, and gives it a firm slap, not for health, but because tradition is tradition. You're drenched, panting, possibly hallucinating St. Bridget in the rafters, but you're alive. And so, miraculously, is this furious, red-faced creature now wailing in your arms. The cord is tied off with linen thread and will eventually be cut with a knife that may or may not have just gutted a fish. But antiseptic doesn't exist, so what's the worst that could happen? Congratulations, you've survived. For now. The village women will whisper your name with awe. At least until 13 months from now, when you'll be dragged back onto the stool again. But sometimes, there is no cry. Just silence. A stillbirth, common and terrifying, not only in grief, but in theology. Because here's the medieval catch: an unbaptized baby doesn't go to heaven. Not even purgatory. Instead, they're stuck in limbo, a cosmic waiting room with no snacks, no toys, and no exit. Panic sets in. The midwife pivots from battlefield medic to emergency priest. Holy water is ideal, but if that's not handy, wine, river water, or even spit will do. The rules bend when eternity's on the line. If the infant shows the faintest twitch, hiccup, or squeak, baptism is immediate, often before the cord is cut. Anyone can do it: the midwife, the herbalist, your cousin Mildred. Literacy not required. Salvation doesn't wait for paperwork. But if the child is truly stillborn, things get murkier. Some communities attempt baptism of intention, essentially telling God, "We meant to baptize them, so count it." Others try baptism by desire, or hedge their bets with a conditional baptism, just in case the baby was secretly alive for a half second. Meanwhile, theologians debate endlessly in monasteries while mothers sit clutching silence. If baptism succeeds, the child is washed, wrapped, and honored as a tiny saint. If not, well, the midwife remains practical. She prepares the body, offers what comfort she can, and life in the village moves on, with you left in the aftermath, exhausted, hollow, and caught between faith, grief, and survival. If not, well, the priest will mutter something vague and hopeful over a shallow grave, and life lurches on as it always does, messy, uncertain, unrelenting. Congratulations, you've survived medieval childbirth. Your prize? A steaming bowl of something that may or may not be food, a half-hearted prayer of thanks, and total abandonment. See, while the birth itself was an all-hands spectacle, midwife, herbalist, curious neighbors, and at least one nosy chicken, postpartum care is more of a good luck, figure it out affair. You're bleeding, aching, and possibly feverish. The midwife has already packed her talismans and goose feathers and trudged off to the next village. Your husband? He's busy raising a mug with his brothers to celebrate the new heir, which, to him, is far more urgent than checking if you're still alive. Stitches don't exist, by the way. Neither do ice packs, pelvic rest, or lactation consultants. What you get are linen rags, a compress that smells like a hedge, and blind faith that your uterus knows how to sort itself out. Meanwhile, your other children haven't evaporated. The snot-crusted, flea-bitten crew still expect meals, discipline, and the occasional hug, all ideally provided by you, bleeding or not. Chores remain chores, sheep need milking, fires need tending, and the village won't stop just because you've survived a small war. Feeling faint from blood loss? Normal. Feeling depressed? That's demons. Cry too often and the priest will arrive to sprinkle holy water on you like you're mold creeping up a church wall. If that doesn't fix it, clearly you didn't pray hard enough in labor. In some places, there's even a ritual for you, churching. It's less celebration, more purification, because childbirth, naturally, made you spiritually dirty. Until the priest performs the blessing, you're in a kind of social limbo, neither fully part of the community nor free from whispered suspicion. Quarantine, but without peace and quiet. As for gifts, don't expect flowers or casseroles. At best, you'll get bread, a hunk of cheese, or a hand-me-down blanket from someone's attic chest. The baby is the star of the show now, and you? You go back to work. Your official recovery plan is brutally simple: don't die. Pull that off, and you've already beaten the odds. About 30% of your peers won't. You've bled, screamed, and survived a medieval battlefield disguised as childbirth. Surely, a feast or a hot bath awaits. Wrong. What you get is churching, a priestly pat on the head, and the privilege of returning to normal life, where another pregnancy is probably already waiting in the wings. About 40 days after giving birth, provided you haven't died, been accused of witchcraft, or decided to haunt the village, it's time for your spiritual tune-up. According to church logic, all that mortal bleeding has left you ritually impure. Not sinful exactly, just suspiciously gross. So the priest summons you for a public little rite to scrub your soul and officially reinstate you as a respectable member of Christendom. Think of it as your medieval re-entry permit. You dress in your finest, translation, the least stained gown you own, hide the fact that you still feel like your bones are glued together wrong, and hobble to the church. Sometimes you carry a candle, partly for symbolism, partly so nobody mistakes you for an unbaptized ghost. The priest thanks God for sparing your life, mumbles a few prayers, sprinkles holy water, and voila, you're clean enough for Mass again. Congratulations. You've basically just attended a sanctified, wash your hands tutorial. It's quick, awkward, and not so subtly insulting, but some women actually look forward to it. Why? Because it means they can finally leave the house without whispers about their demon-tempting aura or their unholy effect on crops. Afterward, you're free to walk the market, free to attend Mass, and tragically, free to get pregnant again. The cycle resets. God has forgiven your uterus. The neighbors stop side-eyeing you at the well. You can even dip your fingers in holy water without someone hissing. Progress. By now the baby is named, baptized, and occasionally asleep, and you're daring to think, we made it. Not so fast. Medieval parenthood is less happily ever after and more grim lottery ticket. Infant mortality isn't just common, it's expected. About a third of babies don't survive their first year. That means your village graveyard holds more children than the schoolyard ever will. Parents don't even bother embroidering names on blankets until the second birthday, just in case. That drooling, hiccuping bundle in your arms? Statistically, the odds are stacked against them. But for now, just for today, they're here. And so are you. Which, in the Middle Ages, counts as a victory. Your newborn is up against a medieval obstacle course: fevers, dysentery, pneumonia, plague, starvation, and whatever questionable substance is currently sloshing in the family well. Oh, and teething, which the Church hasn't yet classified as a mortal danger, but every mother knows can still flatten a child. You fight back with the few tools at hand. Swaddle tight. Feed when you can. Pray to Saint Anne, Saint Margaret, Saint Bridget, basically anyone rumored to have connections in the celestial childcare department. You keep the fire burning, tuck dried herbs under the cradle, and hammer an iron nail into the doorframe to keep out evil spirits. Because if sickness doesn't take your baby, the fairies might. Yes, changelings. Many believe that sickly children aren't ill at all, they've been swapped by mischievous woodland folk. Remedies range from the disturbing, leave the baby overnight on a dung heap to scare the fairies away, to the downright horrifying, holding them over fire while reciting the Lord's Prayer. None of it counts as medicine, but welcome to medieval parenting. If the baby dies, you bury them quietly. There are no grief counselors, no casseroles, just a small wooden marker and a whispered prayer. If the child was baptized, you cling to the comfort of heaven. If not, theology gets murky fast. Either way, families carry on. You may even reuse the name for the next child like it's a hand-me-down tunic. No one thinks twice. Grief is so stitched into daily life it feels like part of the fabric itself. Still, love persists, stubborn, irrational, and defiant. And surviving infancy? That's the real miracle. Now comes the next trial, feeding the baby. Also known as trying to keep a tiny human alive using two medieval devices strapped to your chest that may or may not cooperate. If your milk comes in, congratulations. If not, you're already failing medieval motherhood's impossible checklist. Breastfeeding is the default, but it's a gamble, like churning butter with no sleep and a side of anxiety. You do your best. You sit by the hearth, baby latched, hopefully, while the midwife shouts unsolicited advice like a medieval lactation consultant with zero training but plenty of opinions. Rub goose fat on the nipples. Avoid cold bread. Pray to Saint Agatha, who, incidentally, had her breasts cut off, so she's sympathetic. Some days it works. Other days the baby wails while your breasts harden into medieval siege weapons. Enter the wet nurse. If you're noble, or desperate with a few coins to spare, you can outsource the job. Wet nurses are women who've recently given birth themselves and now serve as professional human milk dispensers. It's practical, but fraught with tension, gossip, and the faint smell of goats. There are strict rules. She must not have sex, it spoils the milk, apparently, she must eat properly, and she mustn't show too much affection. After all, the baby is yours, even if she's the one keeping it alive. She mustn't eat garlic. Same reason as sex, it'll spoil the milk. And heaven forbid she gets too attached to your child, because affection is apparently more dangerous than plague. A wet nurse is essentially the Uber Eats of the feudal world, delivering nourishment, sprinkled with moral warnings from the church, and topped off with more saliva than anyone requested. If you're not rich enough for that, you might gamble on animal milk. Cow, goat, or, heaven help the one desperate soul, pig. Without refrigeration or sterilization, it's less nutrition and more an open invitation for dysentery to move into the cradle. Schedules? Forget it. You feed when the baby cries, or when your breasts soak through your only chemise. Growth charts don't exist. The closest you get to science is, he looks slightly less shriveled than yesterday. Weaning is another gamble, featuring pre-chewed bread or wine-soaked rags, which sounds less like childcare and more like a tavern dare. Still, if the baby is breathing, gaining a little weight, and not projectile vomiting demons, you're doing fine. You've survived childbirth, dodged infection, juggled wet nurses and changeling paranoia, and even been ritually cleansed by the church. Surely now you've earned a peaceful stretch of parenting? Absolutely not. This is the Middle Ages, and your uterus is a public utility. You're expected to conceive again before you've even healed. Family planning isn't a concept, unless hoping for a boy this time counts as strategy. Contraception exists, but it's equal parts unreliable and horrifying. Sheep intestines, bitter herbs, or prayers to saints who never studied gynecology. Meanwhile, your husband has been very patient, 40 long days of abstinence while you were considered ritually unclean. Now he's back to performing his duty, which takes about 30 seconds and leaves you wishing for a pilgrimage, or at least a nap. But no, the clock resets, and once again your fertility becomes the village's favorite gossip topic. If you're lucky, you'll go a few months before quickening. That's fetal movement, not a magic Highlander gemstone. Statistically, though, you'll be pregnant again within 18 months. The midwife already has you penciled in. The priest twitches whenever you walk into church, as if bracing for another baptism. And your older children? They're being drafted into the family business, childcare, housework, and, eventually, funeral attendance. Because in the medieval world, siblings are less about companionship and more about unpaid labor. You've slipped into the rhythm of medieval motherhood, a relentless dance of diapers, death, and divine forgiveness. There's no exit until menopause, plague, or both. And yet, despite the pain, danger, and absolutely deranged medical advice, you keep going. Maybe because of faith. Maybe because of love. Or maybe because it's the 14th century and, frankly, there aren't many other hobbies. So the cycle begins again. Cue the ominous lute music. You're exhausted, stitched, sore, and vaguely sticky. And then, somehow, there's a baby in your arms. A real one. Warm, squirming, screaming like it owns the place. Against every odd, every prayer, every useless man loitering outside the birthing room, it's here. Alive? And that alone is a miracle. Because childbirth in the Middle Ages was less natural process and more a game of dice. Roll poorly, and you land on death by fever, breech disaster, or possession by wayward womb spirits. The church might call survival divine providence, but every woman who made it through knew the truth. This was raw endurance, stitched together with instinct, stubbornness, and a good midwife's sharp elbows. She pats your head like a blacksmith admiring her finest horseshoe. The priest lingers awkwardly, caught between "congratulations" and "thank God you're not dead." And you? You look down at this red, squishy creature and whisper, "How do I keep you alive?" You've got no manuals, no pediatricians, no baby monitors. Just milk, intuition, and a talisman dangling over the cradle to ward off demons. Parenting, medieval edition. And yet, something inside you knows you'll do it again. Again and again. Because in a world of mud, firewood, and plagues with names that sound like tavern curses, this tiny heartbeat is everything. Hope swaddled in linen. A future wrapped in mashed peas and potential. Soon the neighbors will crowd in with bread, gossip, and superstitions. The wet nurse will arrive. You'll be warned to avoid eels, butter, strong emotions, and singing in minor keys, all for the baby's health. You'll nod, half listen, and try to make sense of it. But not yet. Not tonight. For now, in the flickering half-light, you breathe. You cradle. You cry. Because somehow, in a world where everything is dangerous and nothing is promised, you've done the impossible. Birth wasn't just survival. It was rebellion. And every single time, it was a miracle. We're drifting back to a world of velvet robes, drafty castles, and family trees that looked less like majestic oaks and more like tangled hedges someone gave up pruning. As always, make yourself comfortable. Dim the lights. Settle in. If you drift off halfway through, don't worry, you'll be missing only the mild scandal of a royal cousin marrying another cousin who, in turn, was also their aunt. Nothing too urgent. So, the Habsburgs, the family most famous for proving that too much togetherness can, in fact, be a bad thing. They ruled vast swaths of Europe for centuries, collected titles the way some people collect novelty mugs, and maintained their dynasty through a dedication to intermarriage that can only be described as determined. The Habsburg jaw, as it's known, wasn't so much a family trait as a slow-motion genetic inheritance plan. Over generations, their protruding chins and elongated faces grew more pronounced, to the point where some rulers struggled to chew properly, or, in one case, even to close their mouths entirely. Naturally, this was not considered a deal-breaker when arranging yet another cousin-to-cousin marriage. After all, nothing says eternal power like ensuring your descendants will look like caricatures of themselves. Let's float gently into one particular branch of this dynasty, Charles II of Spain, sometimes referred to as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. And no, that's not because he had a charming witchy sparkle about him. It was because people genuinely thought his catastrophic health problems must be the result of sorcery. The real explanation was slightly less magical: centuries of marrying too close to home. Charles was born in 1661, the only surviving son of King Philip IV of Spain and his second wife, Mariana of Austria. She was also his niece, which made the family gatherings a bit more confusing than usual. From birth, Charles struggled with severe developmental issues. He couldn't speak until he was 4, and he didn't walk until he was 8. His Habsburg jaw was so pronounced that eating solid food was a daily challenge. And yet, he was crowned king of one of the largest empires in the world. Imagine a man who technically ruled Spain, its American colonies, parts of Italy, and a collection of territories scattered across Europe, but who couldn't even chew a piece of bread without difficulty. Of course, the court physicians had many helpful theories about his ailments. Too much cold air, demonic possession, the usual. Modern historians, however, are fairly confident that Charles suffered from a staggering amount of genetic inbreeding. His family tree shows that his parents were uncle and niece, his grandparents were also uncle and niece, and at several points, the same few ancestors appear on nearly every branch. In fact, when geneticists modeled his ancestry, they found his inbreeding coefficient was higher than if his parents had been full siblings. Now, that's commitment. Charles lived a short and sad life. His attempts at marriage were, predictably, childless. And when he died in 1700, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty died with him. His death also sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, which sounds grand but was mostly about other European families fighting over who got to inherit the mess. Let's drift a little further back, though, because the Habsburgs weren't the only culprits. They just perfected the art of marrying your cousin until your chin developed its own gravitational pull. Take, for instance, Charles's father, Philip IV of Spain. He married twice. The first time, to Elizabeth of France, which was at least a little more reasonable in terms of genetic diversity. The second time, however, he married Mariana of Austria, his own niece. This was not seen as particularly shocking at the time. If anything, it was considered a practical arrangement. Why waste a perfectly good niece when you could keep the power in the family? Philip himself was not a particularly robust figure. He was known as the Planet King, though this was less about celestial brilliance and more because Spain's empire was so sprawling it seemed to encompass half the globe. In practice, his reign was marked by decline, endless wars, and a court full of scheming favorites. Still, his most lasting contribution may have been passing along that distinctive jawline, which he himself sported with moderate pride. His wife/niece Mariana was no healthier. She became regent after Philip's death, ruling Spain on behalf of her ailing son Charles. Her regency was marked by factional squabbles, economic collapse, and the occasional accusation of witchcraft, again, mostly directed at her son's ill health. It's worth noting that when a dynasty gets to the point where people assume the king must be cursed because of how sickly he is, perhaps it's time to reconsider the matchmaking strategy. But the Habsburgs were nothing if not persistent. If we wander back even further, we find Philip's father, Philip III, and his wife Margaret of Austria, who was, predictably, his cousin. Their children continued the tradition of intermarriage, narrowing the family gene pool until it resembled more of a puddle. Philip III himself was known for being pious and deeply uninterested in ruling. He left most of the governing to his favorites, particularly the Duke of Lerma, who was impressively corrupt even by the standards of the Spanish court. And behind all of these kings and queens, there was the ever-present family resemblance, the drooping lower lip, the elongated face, and the increasingly fragile constitution. It wasn't just about looks, though. The inbreeding had real consequences. Fertility rates plummeted. Infant mortality soared. Even when children survived infancy, they often grew up weak, sickly, or intellectually impaired. But for the Habsburgs, marrying outside the family was considered riskier than marrying inside it. Better to have a son who couldn't chew than risk sharing power with a rival dynasty. Now, it would be unfair to let the Habsburgs take all the blame. They were simply the most enthusiastic practitioners of a widespread royal habit. The Valois of France, for example, were prone to fragile heirs and suspiciously repetitive family names. Catherine de' Medici, the Italian Queen of France, married her children into various noble families, but still couldn't escape the curse of frailty. Her sons Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III all became kings, and all died without leaving strong heirs. France eventually had to hand the crown to the Bourbons, who at least mixed things up a little genetically. In England, too, royal marriages often circled back on themselves. The Tudors, thankfully, were spared the most extreme examples, though Henry VIII certainly did his best to create dynastic chaos in other ways. By the time the Stuarts took over, cousin marriages were once again fashionable. But no one ever outdid the Habsburgs. Even outside Spain, their Austrian line carried on the tradition. Emperors like Leopold I of the Holy Roman Empire also displayed the famous jaw, along with the customary collection of illnesses. Leopold married 3 times, 2 of those wives were related to him. His children included Joseph I and Charles VI, both of whom inherited the Habsburg look and the fragile health that came with it. Charles VI's daughter, Maria Theresa, is perhaps the most famous Habsburg of all. She inherited a precarious empire and fought to keep it together during the War of the Austrian Succession. She also had 16 children, many of whom were married off into other royal families, spreading the Habsburg features across Europe like a sort of genetic calling card. One of her daughters was Marie Antoinette, who ended up in France just in time to lose her head. It's interesting to note that by this point, the jaw had softened somewhat, though the reputation for poor judgment remained intact. And so the story drifts on, jawlines growing longer, bloodlines growing thinner, and dynasties clinging to power through marriages that were less about love and more about desperately clutching onto a throne. What makes this both tragic and slightly absurd is that the results were entirely predictable. By the late 17th century, European physicians were already quietly concerned about the effects of constant cousin marriage. Of course, no one wanted to offend a king by suggesting his heir looked like a confused turnip because of poor genetics. So the practice continued, producing monarchs who were increasingly unfit to rule. Charles II of Spain remains the most famous example, but he was not alone. He was simply the endpoint of a long, deliberate pattern, proof that dynastic ambition can outpace common sense. And with that, let's slowly drift onward. From Spain's haunted court and its jawline dynasty, to other royal families who experimented with the same dangerous game, each with their own peculiar results. We've left the Habsburg chins behind us for a while, and now we're gliding softly into royal nurseries. These were not places of soft lullabies and cheerful mobiles. They were more like miniature courts, grand, political, and frequently dangerous. Imagine a crib, but surrounded by scheming advisors, nervous wet nurses, and the occasional plague outbreak wafting through the palace halls. Royal childhoods were never ordinary. They were filled with gold-threaded blankets and jewel-encrusted rattles, but also with crushing expectations and, very often, crushing illnesses. You could be born the center of an empire one day, and carried out in a tiny coffin a week later. Let's begin with the medieval period, when medicine was, how shall we say it, experimental. Physicians prescribed everything from ground pearls to roasted mouse powder. Babies were swaddled so tightly that they resembled little mummies, on the theory that straight boards and tight wrappings would ensure perfectly straight limbs. Breathing, of course, was optional. If you were a royal infant, your life was less about family bonding and more about immediate politics. You weren't really your parents' child. You belonged to the dynasty. Take, for instance, Edward VI of England, son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. He was born in 1537, to great celebration, finally, a legitimate male heir. But Edward was a frail child from the very start. His mother died of infection shortly after his birth, and Edward was left in the care of a small army of attendants. Every sneeze or cough was treated as a matter of national security. He lived in a carefully controlled environment, yet still managed to contract measles, smallpox, and eventually tuberculosis, which killed him at the age of 15. His brief reign was mostly dominated by his regents arguing over who got to control the boy king, while Edward himself tried to grow into the role of monarch but never had the health for it. Royal childhoods were precarious everywhere. In France, the sons of Catherine de' Medici followed a similarly grim pattern. Francis too was delicate and sickly, dying at 16 after a reign of little consequence. His brother Charles IX survived to 23, but suffered from violent mood swings, paranoia, and tuberculosis. Contemporary accounts suggest he foamed at the mouth during rages and bled from the mouth and ears in his final illness, symptoms not typically associated with robust health. Henry III, the last of the brothers, managed to reach 38, though his reign was beset by crises and his death came via assassination. It was not, overall, a strong advertisement for Valois childcare. And yet, these fragile princes were raised in palaces that glittered with wealth. Their nurseries were filled with carved cradles, tapestries depicting saints and angels, and tutors ready to drill Latin into their ears before they could even form proper sentences. You were never too young to learn you were destined to rule. Unfortunately, no amount of early Latin lessons could fix the fact that so many of them were also destined to die before adulthood. Let's drift across to Spain for another example. Don Carlos, the son of Philip II, was born in 1545. From the start, he was complicated. Accounts describe him as physically deformed, with a hunched back and one leg shorter than the other. His personality was equally troubling. He was prone to violent fits, once attempted to drown a servant, and on another occasion tried to burn down a house simply to watch it collapse. His father, Philip, eventually had him locked up, where Carlos conveniently died at the age of 23. Some whispered poison, others suggested suicide, but most agreed he was not the heir Spain needed. These grim fates were often the direct result of dynastic inbreeding and the belief that keeping power in the family mattered more than keeping heirs alive. The fragile children were symptoms of fragile bloodlines. Of course, not all royal childhoods ended in tragedy. Some children did manage to survive and thrive, though usually in bizarre circumstances. Take Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King. He was born in 1638, after his parents had been married for 23 years without a child. His survival was seen as a miracle, and young Louis was spoiled accordingly. He was given tutors, musicians, and endless displays of affection. But even his childhood was far from stable. When he was only 4, he became king. His regency, led by his mother Anne of Austria and Cardinal Mazarin, was rocked by civil wars known as the Fronde. During this time, little Louis was sometimes forced to flee Paris in the middle of the night. It left him with a lifelong distrust of nobles, and perhaps explains why he later built Versailles, a palace so large and controlling it functioned as a gilded prison for the aristocracy. Even the happiest royal childhoods came with strings attached. The more pampered the child, the less prepared they often were for real life. Imagine being so protected that you never had to dress yourself, feed yourself, or even walk long distances. Royal children grew up surrounded by attendants who did everything for them. As adults, many struggled with even basic self-sufficiency. In Russia, young Tsars and Tsareviches lived in similar splendor, but with an extra layer of danger, court intrigue. Ivan the Terrible, for example, grew up amidst poisonings and assassinations, losing his parents at a young age and enduring years of neglect. He spent much of his childhood roaming the Kremlin halls half feral, throwing animals off balconies and plotting revenge. His later behavior as Tsar, violent purges, fits of rage, and the occasional impalement, probably had something to do with this less than idyllic upbringing. And then there were the superstitions. Royal children were often subject to elaborate rituals meant to protect them. Charms were sewn into their clothing. Relics were placed in their cribs. Astrologers cast horoscopes to predict their futures. But despite all this, infant mortality remained high. In some dynasties, half or more of all royal children died before adulthood. The gilded cradle was not much safer than the peasant's straw bed. It's worth pausing on just how fragile these dynasties really were. Whole empires could hinge on the health of a single infant. A sneeze in the nursery could mean a war in Europe. When young Arthur, Prince of Wales, died in 1502, his younger brother Henry suddenly became heir, and eventually Henry VIII. One child's early death reshaped English history for centuries. The irony is that despite the immense care lavished on royal children, they often fared worse than ordinary ones. Overfeeding, overmedicating, and overprotecting created weak constitutions. Physicians bled children to balance their humors. Rich diets clogged their systems. Lack of exposure to everyday germs left their immune systems helpless. Being royal, in other words, could be hazardous to your health. And yet, these fragile little monarchs-to-be were expected to embody power. Painters depicted them in miniature armor, holding scepters, or perched on thrones. The reality was often far less regal: runny noses, fragile bones, and fevers that could send an entire kingdom into mourning. Let's drift gently to one final example before we pause. Charles VIII of France, born in 1470, was the only surviving son of Louis XI. He became king at just 13. But his childhood left him small, frail, and, according to contemporaries, somewhat simple-minded. His reign was marked by ill-fated military adventures, most notably the invasion of Italy. He died at 27, after hitting his head on a doorway. A royal childhood of constant care and attention, undone by a single low lintel. And that, perhaps, sums up the fragile irony of royal childhoods. Surrounded by wealth, privilege, and armies of attendants, they were still one fever, one accident, or one genetic misstep away from disaster. So let's keep drifting. From golden cradles to uneasy marriages, from fragile infants to equally fragile adults. The dynasty rolls forward, even if the children often do not. We've looked at fragile dynasties and frail royal children. Now it's time to drift gently into the boudoirs and bedrooms of Europe's most illustrious couples. And if that sounds glamorous, don't worry, it wasn't. Royal marriages were less about love and more about treaties, land, and occasionally, producing heirs who looked suspiciously like their cousins. Romance was optional. Pettiness, however, was guaranteed. Let's begin with England, where Henry VIII made marital dysfunction into a personal hobby. Everyone knows the famous rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But the real comedy, in a very slow-motion tragic sense, is how deeply petty Henry could be. Take his marriage to Anne of Cleves. It was arranged for political reasons, of course. Henry needed an alliance with a German duchy. Portraits of Anne were flattering enough that Henry agreed. But when she arrived in person, Henry was disappointed. He declared she looked nothing like her picture and that she smelled unpleasant. The poor woman had done nothing wrong, except exist. Their marriage lasted about 6 months before Henry annulled it, declaring she was as ugly as a Flanders mare. A kind way of saying she did not meet his royal standards. To her credit, Anne accepted the situation gracefully, retired with a generous settlement, and outlived all of Henry's other wives. Sometimes pettiness works out better for the victim than the instigator. But Henry was not unique. If we drift across to France, we find Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Their marriage was supposed to cement relations between France and Austria. Instead, it became a decades-long comedy of awkwardness. Louis, shy and indecisive, reportedly took 7 years to consummate the marriage. 7. In royal terms, this was an international crisis. Entire diplomatic strategies were hanging on whether or not the King of France could bring himself to do the most basic task of producing an heir. Marie Antoinette, meanwhile, was thrust into the French court as a teenager, surrounded by suspicion and gossip. She coped by buying extravagant dresses, gambling, and constructing an artificial peasant village at Versailles where she could pretend to be a shepherdess. As marital strategies go, this one was not ideal. By the time they finally managed to have children, the damage was done. The couple were symbols of royal incompetence, and we all know how that ended. Moving on. In Spain, we find another petty pair, Philip II and his fourth wife, Anna of Austria. Philip had already been married 3 times, one of his earlier wives being Mary I of England, who famously burned Protestants and was not known for her cheerful demeanor. By the time Philip married Anna, he was middle-aged, and she was his young niece. The marriage did produce children, but also endless whispers at court. Philip himself was known for his meticulous nature. He spent hours micromanaging paperwork, sometimes signing documents until his hand cramped. Anna, meanwhile, was forced into the role of cheerful, fertile niece-wife, which cannot have been particularly satisfying. And then there were the truly hostile unions. Take George IV of England and Caroline of Brunswick. Their marriage was a disaster from the start. George was so drunk at the wedding that he had to be propped up. He claimed he found Caroline repulsive and refused to live with her. She, in turn, mocked him openly, calling him fat and unappealing. They separated almost immediately. When George later tried to prevent her from being crowned queen, she attempted to crash the coronation anyway. The doors were literally slammed in her face. It was a marital spat played out in full public view. If we drift further east, Russia offers its own gallery of unhappy couples. Peter III and Catherine the Great are a classic example. Peter was eccentric at best, unstable at worst. He preferred playing with toy soldiers in bed and had an unhealthy admiration for Frederick the Great of Prussia. Catherine, meanwhile, was ambitious, intelligent, and increasingly frustrated. Their marriage collapsed into mutual contempt. Catherine eventually staged a coup, had Peter arrested, and, well, he died shortly afterward under mysterious circumstances. Catherine went on to become one of Russia's greatest rulers. Peter went on to be a cautionary tale about ignoring your wife when she's smarter than you. Not every petty marriage ended in blood, of course. Some simply dragged on in mutual misery. Take Christian VII of Denmark and Caroline Matilda of Great Britain. Christian was mentally unstable, prone to bizarre behavior such as running through the palace at night screaming or beating his servants for fun. Caroline Matilda, lonely and neglected, began an affair with the king's physician, Johann Struensee. For a while, the three of them existed in a strange triangle, with the physician effectively running Denmark while also carrying on with the queen. Eventually, Struensee was arrested and executed, and Caroline was exiled. Christian remained king in name, but his instability left Denmark governed by others. It was less a marriage than a prolonged soap opera. The pettiness wasn't always about affairs or neglect. Sometimes it was about sheer stubbornness. Ferdinand I of Bulgaria and his wife Marie-Louise of Bourbon-Parma loathed each other so much that their arguments became legendary. She hated Bulgaria and thought it barbaric. He hated her disdain. Their quarrels were so bitter that courtiers learned to avoid them entirely. When Marie-Louise died young, Ferdinand mourned her more as a political inconvenience than as a personal loss. And then there's Napoleon and Josephine. Their marriage began with passion, but quickly soured. Josephine was older, charming, but unable to give Napoleon the heir he desperately wanted. He, in turn, had affairs across Europe, leaving Josephine humiliated. Yet he remained emotionally attached to her, even after divorcing her to marry Marie-Louise of Austria. Letters between them reveal a mixture of affection, jealousy, and pettiness. Napoleon once scolded Josephine for not writing to him often enough, while he himself was busy invading countries. Their marriage was less about love than about two people unable to let go. Through all these examples, a theme emerges. Royal marriages weren't meant to be happy. They were meant to bind kingdoms. But when you put two unwilling people together and surround them with gossip, power struggles, and the weight of dynastic expectation, pettiness becomes inevitable. A king sulking in one wing of the palace while his queen sulks in another. A queen spending the treasury on gowns because her husband won't talk to her. A monarch trying to ban his wife from his own coronation. These were not fairy tales. They were soap operas in ermine robes. And yet, somehow, dynasties survived. Heirs were produced, sometimes miraculously. Treaties were upheld, at least for a while. Behind the grandeur of palaces, marriages creaked along in mutual resentment. So as you drift off tonight, imagine the royal bedrooms of history. Not filled with romance, but with sighs, complaints, and the occasional passive-aggressive gesture. After all, when the fate of nations rests on two people tolerating each other, pettiness becomes a matter of state. When you picture a king or queen stepping down, It's tempting to imagine a peaceful ending. A crown laid gently aside. A graceful retreat into prayer, gardening, or perhaps light embroidery. Unfortunately, real monarchs rarely knew when to quit. Retirement was seldom serene. It was awkward, messy, and sometimes fatal. For most of history, monarchs didn't retire at all. The crown was meant to be worn until death, even if you were too sick, too old, or too confused to recognize your own children. Abdication was viewed as suspicious, even shameful. After all, if a king admitted he couldn't rule, what did that say about the whole divine right business? Still, a few monarchs did step down, or were nudged firmly in that direction. And their afterlives as ex-monarchs were usually strange affairs. Let's start with Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. A man with more titles than most people have socks. He ruled Spain, much of Italy, the Low Countries, Austria, and the sprawling territories of the New World. But by the mid-16th century, he was exhausted. Wars, rebellions, religious turmoil, gout, and the general hassle of running half of Europe wore him down. So in 1556, he did the unthinkable. He retired. He handed Spain to his son Philip II, the Holy Roman Empire to his brother Ferdinand, and retreated to a monastery in Spain. There, he intended to spend his remaining days in quiet contemplation. And he did, sort of. Charles brought with him 50 attendants, a personal chef, and enough tapestries to smother any hint of monastic austerity. He dined well, kept up with political gossip, and occasionally staged his own mock funerals, lying in a coffin while monks chanted around him, just to practice for the real thing. It was not exactly humble. He died in 1558, surrounded by more luxury than most actual monks ever saw. Retirement, Habsburg style. A century later, in Sweden, Queen Christina took abdication to a whole new level. Crowned in 1632, she was an eccentric, highly educated ruler who preferred philosophy and theatre to the dull business of governing. By the 1650s, she'd had enough. In 1654, she stunned everyone by abdicating in favor of her cousin. She then left Sweden entirely, converted to Catholicism, and spent the rest of her life wandering across Europe. Christina was flamboyant, opinionated, and perpetually short of money. She refused to marry, collected scholars and artists, and meddled in politics whenever she could. Rome became her adopted home, where she lived in style, throwing parties and making herself a minor celebrity. Technically retired, but never really out of the spotlight. England offers another famous example, Edward VIII. In 1936, he abdicated in order to marry Wallis Simpson, the American divorcee who had captured his heart. It was a romantic gesture, or at least it seemed that way at the time. In reality, it was also an escape. Edward was never particularly interested in the hard work of kingship. Abdication let him indulge his personal life without the burden of statecraft. He became the Duke of Windsor and spent the rest of his life in comfortable semi-exile, drifting between villas in France and the Bahamas. Occasionally, he gave interviews, usually complaining about how unfairly he'd been treated. His wife, Wallis, enjoyed the social whirl. Neither of them seemed to miss actual ruling. The British monarchy, meanwhile, quietly sighed with relief. Sometimes, retirement wasn't voluntary. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas II didn't exactly choose to step down. In 1917, amidst revolution, he abdicated under pressure, hoping it might preserve the monarchy in some form. It did not. He and his family were placed under house arrest, moved from palace to palace, and eventually executed. Retirement, in this case, was not peaceful. Japan, however, offers a gentler example. For centuries, emperors were often expected to abdicate. Power usually rested with shoguns, so emperors became ceremonial figures who sometimes stepped aside in favor of their heirs. In recent times, Emperor Akihito became the first Japanese monarch in 2 centuries to abdicate, stepping down in 2019 at the age of 85. His retirement has been quiet, marked by gardening, music, and the occasional polite wave. A rare case of abdication that actually looks like a dignified exit. But let's drift back again, to those medieval and early modern kings who found themselves uncomfortably retired. Richard II of England was forced to abdicate in 1399 by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned and quietly starved to death. It was not the sort of retirement package one hopes for. Mary, Queen of Scots, endured a similarly awkward fate. After a disastrous reign in Scotland, marked by poor choices in husbands and endless political plots, she abdicated in favor of her infant son James. Mary then fled to England, hoping her cousin Elizabeth I would offer support. Instead, Elizabeth placed her under house arrest for nearly 20 years, before finally executing her. Again, not a peaceful retirement. Abdicated monarchs often faced a problem: they were still dangerous. Even stripped of crowns, they could be rallying points for rebellions. A retired king lounging around in a castle might inspire too much loyalty. Which is why so many abdicated rulers ended up imprisoned, exiled, or simply dead. Yet a few found genuine peace. In Portugal, King Pedro V died young, but his brother, Luís I, lived long enough to retire into a quieter role, indulging his love of the arts. In Italy, King Victor Emmanuel III abdicated after World War II and slipped into exile in Egypt, where he lived out his final years in relative obscurity, collecting stamps and avoiding attention. It's the contrast that's striking. Some monarchs clung to power until death, drooling in their thrones while courtiers propped them up. Others stepped aside and found unexpected second lives, as gardeners, musicians, travelers, or merely faded relics. The crown might weigh heavy, but giving it up came with its own burdens. So, as you drift further into sleep, imagine the strange lives of these ex-monarchs. Some pacing their monasteries in silk robes, staging practice funerals. Some sipping wine in Paris salons, insisting they were still important. Some locked in towers, waiting for a fate that never came gently. Retired, yes, but never really free. Tonight we're floating back into the dim corridors of European palaces. But instead of focusing on the familiar Habsburg jawlines, we'll drift into other dynasties that were equally determined to keep their bloodlines pure. Or, in practice, unusually fragile. You might think of the Habsburgs as the champions of dynastic inbreeding. And yes, they deserve their gold medal in the family marriage Olympics. But they weren't the only ones who thought second cousins made excellent spouses. Across Europe, royal families were busy drawing circles around their family trees. The results were predictable. Let's start with the Bourbons. They ruled France, Spain, and occasionally other places that needed a Bourbon on the throne. The Bourbon obsession with marrying cousins produced some of the most spectacular medical collapses in royal history. One of the more famous examples was King Charles II of Spain. Technically he was a Habsburg, but his inbreeding coefficient was the result of both Habsburg and Bourbon entanglements. Charles was so thoroughly inbred that his family tree looked less like a branching oak and more like a poorly knotted shoelace. He was frail, sickly, and mentally impaired, dying childless at 38. But if we drift past Charles, we find plenty of Bourbon cousins still enthusiastically marrying each other. In France, Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, married his double first cousin, Maria Theresa of Spain. Their son Louis, the Grand Dauphin, then married yet another cousin, Maria Anna of Bavaria. The pattern was clear: keep it in the family. By the time the Bourbons reached the 18th century, hemophilia, developmental delays, and a generally lackluster pool of heirs were frequent visitors at Versailles. The Wittelsbachs of Bavaria offer another curious study. They weren't quite as dramatic as the Habsburgs, but they still managed some eyebrow-raising unions. Their family portraits reveal a certain sameness, long noses, heavy eyelids, and a general air of people who should probably have widened the gene pool. King Ludwig II, the so-called Mad King of Bavaria, wasn't the product of extreme inbreeding himself, but he certainly carried the dynastic eccentricity gene. His cousin, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi, also belonged to the Wittelsbachs and displayed her own streak of instability, obsessively dieting, exercising, and composing melancholy poetry. If we wander northward, the Scandinavian monarchies had fewer dramatic cases, but they weren't immune. The Danish and Norwegian courts often recycled German princesses from the same handful of families. This created a kind of shared European aristocratic look, delicate, pale, slightly weary, though less extreme than the Habsburg or Bourbon collapses. Russia provides a darker example. The Romanovs, particularly when they married into German houses, ended up with the infamous hemophilia gene. Carried by Queen Victoria of Britain, hemophilia spread through European courts like an uninvited guest. Tsarevic Alexei, son of Nicholas II, suffered terribly from the condition. His frequent health crises opened the door to mystics like Rasputin, who claimed to have healing powers. Without hemophilia, Rasputin might never have become a household name. All thanks to repeated cousin marriages tracing back to Queen Victoria's sprawling brood. Speaking of Victoria, the British monarchy deserves its own moment. Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, were first cousins. This was not considered odd at the time. Their descendants married liberally across Europe, often to other cousins. The result was an impressive dynasty, but also one riddled with genetic fragility. Hemophilia appeared in Spain, Russia, and Germany, all through Victoria's children and grandchildren. One of the more tragic cases was Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, the heir to the Spanish throne in the early 20th century. He inherited hemophilia from his mother, Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Alfonso lived a short, painful life, dying after a minor car accident caused uncontrollable bleeding. All because generations of royals thought marrying a close relative was perfectly reasonable. Sometimes the effects of inbreeding were more subtle. Kings and queens who appeared healthy might still struggle with fertility, miscarriages, or fragile heirs. The Bourbon-Parma branch, for example, endured generations of sickly children. The Bourbon II Sicily's line produced heirs who were more decorative than durable. And in Sardinia, the Savoy dynasty married cousins so often that, by the 19th century, their family tree looked suspiciously flat. Let's drift gently over to Portugal. The Braganza dynasty had its share of cousin marriages, leading to a parade of monarchs who were either childless or produced only a handful of heirs, many of whom died young. King Ferdinand II married his cousin Queen Maria II, and their descendants kept the cycle going. The result was a monarchy always teetering on the edge of extinction. It's worth noting that inbreeding wasn't always immediately catastrophic. Sometimes it produced heirs who were perfectly competent. Louis XV of France, for example, was descended from multiple cousin marriages but managed to reign for decades. Of course, he also managed to bankrupt France with his wars and mistresses, so competent might be a generous term. The irony is that these dynasties insisted on cousin marriage to preserve purity and dynastic unity, yet often destroyed their own genetic health in the process. Instead of purity, they got hemophilia, infertility, and monarchs who could barely stand upright. The obsession with controlling who married whom narrowed their bloodlines to the point of absurdity. By the 19th and 20th centuries, science finally caught up. Doctors began warning that repeated cousin marriages carried risks. The rising tide of nationalism also encouraged monarchies to marry outside their immediate family circles, to form alliances across nations rather than within them. This is why today's European royals tend to marry non-royals, commoners, celebrities, or just people they happen to meet at university. The modern Windsors, for example, are far less inbred than their ancestors, and healthier for it. Still, the echoes of dynastic inbreeding linger. Hemophilia, once rampant in European courts, has mostly died out. But the stories remain: fragile heirs, sickly children, eccentric monarchs with suspiciously repetitive family trees. These were the hidden costs of keeping crowns in the family. So, as you drift further into sleep, picture the great palaces of Europe not as centers of glory, but as elaborate echo chambers. Cousins marrying cousins. Bloodlines looping back on themselves. Portrait galleries filled with faces that all look faintly alike. Dynasties that prized purity so much, they weakened themselves. Not just the Habsburgs, but Bourbons, Wittelsbachs, Braganzas, Romanovs, and beyond. All of them entangled in the same tight family knot. A knot that often unraveled, one sickly heir at a time. We're drifting back into palaces again. But instead of fragile heirs or gloomy bloodlines, we're going to explore something a little more human. Pettiness. Because for all their crowns, scepters, and thrones, kings and queens were often little more than very wealthy people with very bad tempers. And their tantrums could shake entire kingdoms. Let's start with King Louis XIV of France. The Sun King, radiant, glorious, master of Versailles. He ruled longer than almost any monarch in European history. And he spent much of that time being spectacularly petty. He quarreled constantly with nobles over the tiniest points of etiquette. One duke was banished from court for daring to sit in the king's presence without explicit permission. Another was forced to stand for hours while Louis lectured him about the proper way to hand over a letter. Versailles was less a palace and more a glittering kindergarten, with Louis playing headmaster. Across the Channel, in England, George III is remembered as the mad king who lost America. But before his illness took over, he displayed an impressive streak of pettiness. He insisted that his children live under suffocatingly strict rules, forbidding them from marrying without his consent. This went so far that several of his sons fathered illegitimate children rather than risk his wrath. His sons, in turn, responded with their own brand of dysfunction: gambling, drinking, and running up mountains of debt. The House of Hanover was, in essence, a family feud with crowns attached. Spain offers the case of Philip II, who ruled during the height of Spain's power in the 16th century. Philip was devout, serious, and deeply controlling. He kept endless notes on his courtiers, recording even the smallest infractions. He insisted that ambassadors wait hours outside his chambers, just to demonstrate his importance. And he had a habit of refusing to make decisions until the very last possible moment, driving his ministers mad. His reign was a masterclass in micromanagement, the sort of behavior that today might get you unfollowed on social media. Moving north, let's pause with Christian VII of Denmark. He reigned in the late 18th century and is remembered less for achievements than for dysfunction. Christian was mentally unstable, prone to fits of paranoia, and obsessed with self-indulgence. He neglected affairs of state in favor of drinking, gambling, and, somewhat tragically, compulsive self-gratification. His court became a chaos of factions, with his physician Johann Struensee effectively running the kingdom for a time. Christian's pettiness came in the form of jealous rages and sudden firings of officials who displeased him. Dysfunction was his only consistent policy. Then there's Queen Isabella II of Spain in the 19th century. Her reign was a tangle of scandals. She had a notorious series of affairs, often with military officers, which made her court resemble more of a soap opera than a functioning government. She was so openly dismissive of her husband, King Consort Francis, that satirists joked Spain had two queens and no king. Petty feuds between her favorites frequently spilled into politics, sparking uprisings and instability. Eventually, she was forced into exile, leaving behind a legacy of drama rather than stability. We should not forget Catherine de' Medici of France, Queen Mother and Regent during the Wars of Religion. Catherine was intelligent, cunning, and often ruthless. But she could also be astoundingly petty. She played nobles against each other, stirred rumors, and sometimes encouraged courtly scandals just to keep rivals distracted. Her gift for manipulation was legendary, but at its heart was a kind of palace-level pettiness. Catherine didn't always need a grand strategy. Sometimes she just needed someone she disliked to have a very bad day. Even monarchs remembered fondly weren't immune. Elizabeth I of England was brilliant, charismatic, and politically savvy. She was also deeply insecure about her appearance. Courtiers who commented on her wrinkles or dared to suggest she might be aging were swiftly dismissed. She banished her beloved Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, after he returned from a failed military campaign without her permission. When he tried to reconcile, she had him executed. For Elizabeth, affection and vengeance were sometimes separated only by a few hours of sulking. In Austria, Emperor Franz Joseph and his famously eccentric wife Elizabeth, Sisi, lived in a marriage defined by dysfunction. Franz Joseph was rigid and dutiful, spending endless hours at his desk signing papers. Sisi, meanwhile, loathed the formality of court life and spent most of her time traveling. Their pettiness came in the form of passive-aggressive avoidance. He ruled, she rode horses and wrote poetry. They saw each other as little as possible, and their court became a study in cold distance. Perhaps one of the most theatrical displays of royal dysfunction came from Peter the Great of Russia. He modernized his empire with reforms, shipyards, and a new capital at St. Petersburg. But he also had volcanic temper tantrums. He forced nobles to shave their beards under threat of fines, personally handling the scissors in some cases. He arranged mock parades to humiliate courtiers, and when displeased with his own son Alexei, he had him tortured to death. Peter's legacy was progress, yes, but also pettiness on an imperial scale. And then there was Frederick William I of Prussia, the so-called Soldier King. He loved his army more than anything, to the point of collecting unusually tall soldiers for his personal regiment. He was petty enough to treat them less like people and more like prized collectibles, often parading them purely for his amusement. He also despised luxury, but in the most hypocritical way, lecturing his court on frugality while spending enormous sums on his beloved tall grenadiers. Dysfunction, but with a military marching band. When we look at these monarchs, the pattern is clear. Their crowns did not make them noble in spirit. Often, they amplified the smallest flaws, jealousy, vanity, stubbornness, until entire nations felt the weight of a royal sulk. Kingdoms rose and fell, not just through war or famine, but because someone refused to forgive a slight at dinner. So as you sink deeper into rest, imagine these rulers in their palaces. Elizabeth glaring at her mirror, Louis XIV insisting a duke stand a little farther back, Christian VII wandering off into another distraction, Catherine de' Medici plotting an inconvenient scandal. Petty, proud, dysfunctional. And yet, utterly human. In the end, the great dynasties of Europe weren't toppled only by revolutions or invasions. Sometimes, they were undone by nothing more than royal bickering.